Thank you for attending the webinar, coming here. We have a great program this evening. We have Pat Rose from Save the Manatee Club and Ragan Whitlock from the Center for Biological Diversity going to give us a presentation on the status of the manatees in the state of Florida. And we do have a question answer box on the bottom. You can put in any questions you have, and also the chat box. With that, I would like to turn it over to Pat. Would you please introduce yourself and start off our program?
Yeah, good evening. I'm Pat Rose. I'm an aquatic biologist and the executive director for Save the Manatee Club. I've been working professionally a little over 45 years with manatees and aquatic ecosystem projects and water quality. It's been through a number of different organizations. Started out literally as a volunteer for Florida Audubon Society back in 1976 and went on to be the first federal manatee recovery coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And from there, started and ran and built the state of Florida's programs for manatees and marine mammals for quite a few years before retiring in 1996, and then left the state in retirement and went to work for Save the Manatee Club, which I was actually the first scientific advisor for starting in 1981 as a volunteer for 16 years. So then was able to return there and actually work for the organization. So that takes us through a few years there and a number of different organizations and partners, and was ready to retire a couple of years ago, but things I will talk about tonight will explain why that's just not possible and how so much more is going to have to happen. And I'll maybe even take a minute to talk about some things without slides. The background of the manatee program in Florida and so forth is one of really strong success for decades. And right up until about the time I'm going to focus on tonight, starting in around 2009, we've been seeing really significant recovery in the population, starting at about 800 to 1,000 when I first started working full-time with manatee recovery efforts. I was a member of each of the manatee recovery teams that were established and put together. It was a remarkable program, major successes, but this last decade has shown a lot of neglect. And then what I'll do is go ahead and start sharing my screen now, and we'll go into some of those problem issues. Let me get this to the right format, and I think we'll be able to go from there. Hopefully you can see how my screen in a large format. So I like to throw this in because it's a fun photo for me. It's one I took with a very, very large alligator at Blue Spring and manatees, and it's kind of interesting. Manatees are big, but they're gentle, they're not aggressive, they really don't have the ability to be aggressive, but even these really large alligators will give way to them. And of course, my point here is that they have learned to share the waterway. I think we all can too. So just throwing in a few older legacy photos. That's me second from the right, looking a little different than I do today. This is a momentous or monumental day for manatees and for the space program. We were at the Tice power plant in Fort Myers and capturing manatees to fit them with satellite and radio transmitters. And that's the day the space shuttle blew up. And so it was a very, very cold day. I put it in because it's a good example of when you're working well with organizations, and I was working for the Florida Department of Natural Resources at the time. There's participants here from the U.S. Geological Service, which actually at the time was the Serenia project with Florida Fish and Wildlife Service. Later, the research went into the USGS, but lest I get into too much detail. But my point here is that although we've been coordinating closely with the environmental folks within the Florida Power and Light Company, there was a breakdown in communications, and there was no warm water this day, and there wasn't going to be warm water, and there were hundreds of manatees dependent upon that warm water at that power plant. and it wasn't on. And so literally, if that had not been corrected, we would have seen, hundreds of manatees likely die as a result of that. The space shuttle blew up principally because it was so cold that the seals shrunk and leaked in the solid fuel booster recovery, or solid fuel boosters. Anyway, I'll come back to power plants, and I'll end my talk today about some of the important things that are going to have to happen, because so many manatees remain dependent upon those. Yet with climate change and the need to deal with elimination of fossil fuels, we've got to come up with a really serious plan to help those manatees transition off of that dependence and, of course, secure our natural springs. Again, throwing in a couple of older photographs working with manatees. There's been a tremendous amount of research, a lot that's been learned, a lot of effort's gone into helping them heal from the watercraft injuries and so forth. Just throw in a couple of other ones, nostalgic. The one on the photo on the right is Jimmy and I in 1982 going through public service announcements, and of course you can't really get where you need to go unless people learn about why it's important to save manatees and protect their aquatic ecosystems. A lot of what I'll talk about tonight is going to focus on the Indian River Lagoon, because that's where we have this, which is declared as an unusual mortality event, but it is so much more than that, and it's also something that could have been completely avoided. The information that was forthcoming and available to have prevented this was essentially being ignored. And I spoke earlier how the Manatee Recovery Program was one of the best within the Endangered Species Program, but that really was winding down about the time the problems got much more serious within the Indian River Lagoon itself. And we'll go into some of that detail. And I'm going to leave a lot of time to talk about things and answer questions. So the principal problem with the Indian River Lagoon has been too much nutrient pollution, which has led to a series of harmful algal blooms that have shaded out the seagrass because of just the literal density of those algal blooms. This is just an example. The first super bloom occurred in 2011, and there have been significant numbers of them since then. Officially, the St. Johns River Water Management District will indicate we've lost about 56% of the seagrass, but when you really look at biomass, and I'll explain that coming up, we've really lost over 90% of the seagrass biomass within the Indian River Lagoon system, which is about 150 some miles long, 56 miles long. Why is the Indian River Lagoon important to manatees? Well, it's a very diverse ecosystem. There are a number of inlets. It's really not a river in the sense that it doesn't have flow in a uniform direction like, say, the St. Johns River and so forth. It's also there are a location where a number of warm water sources, artificial warm water sources, are there. So it's kind of complicating the issues that are going on presently. Probably most important of what we're talking about is the loss of so much of the seagrass within this. There are I think 7 species of seagrass ultimately that are within the Indian River Lagoon, and there are other macroalgae and of course the phytoplankton, which can get so out of hand with too much pollution coming from the failed septic systems, from the improperly treated wastewater, to the runoff from agriculture, whether it's from the agricultural industry or from people's backyards in terms of the fertilizers and so forth. This is kind of a close-up of the Florida Power and Light power plant there in the Cocoa area. I want to point out, this is where the warm water discharge, it comes out here, and another location over here. This is where the intake is. And as we get into just a little bit of information talking about the feeding program last winter, something that should never have had to happen, but you'll see why ultimately it was necessary, at least for a time, to do that. Well, I'll hold off on getting ahead of myself. Just kind of an example of one of the algal blooms from the 2020 time period. Those, if you get down to the St. Lucie section, there's a tremendous amount of, polluted waters coming through the St. Lucie canal systems into the Indian River Lagoon from Lake Okeechobee. Ongoing issue, some improvements, but by no means has that been controlled. Many of you will know much about that, maybe more about it than I do. So, but it's again part of what feeds and the problems for the Indian River Lagoon itself. This is more in the southern end as opposed to the northern portions of the Indian River Lagoon that I'm going to really concentrate probably more for this presentation. And of course, it can lead to not only the loss of seagrasses, but major fish kills and other problems with dissolved oxygen and other. So the left is a healthy seagrass community. The right is, one that's nearly devoid. There's a few sprigs of seagrass remaining. That's going to become really important to the restoration side of it, because if any of it's left, there's a chance as we improve water quality and improve the conditions within the lagoon that the natural sort of recovery can happen, in addition to those human related things that we'll be talking about a little bit tonight too. Just going into the process, if you look at this graph, this is again St. Johns River Water Management District's data. If you look back going into decades back, you were seeing that there actually were increases in the coverage of seagrass within the IRL. And essentially right around 2009, which is coincidentally about the time that the federal government was starting to back away from some of the important recovery actions for manatees. In 2011, after a very severe 2010 winter that killed hundreds and hundreds of manatees, but more than that, it shocked that ecosystem and it killed, billions of other organisms and even larval fish and so forth. So there was a big dump of additional nutrients that came into that system that helped to go along with all of the induced pollutants, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc., and led to that first super bloom. I've got a little more detail. I don't have many of these charts in it, but let's go through this one because it will help inform what was happening. Again, going back, starting here about 1994, you see there's a significant increase in the coverage of seagrass within the IRL. And then as you get to that time frame in the 2010, 2011, you see a precipitous drop, a small recovery, and then a drop again, and then future drops. And actually, I didn't have time to put it in, but the 21 data show a further drop. But that only is half of the explanation. If you go to the bottom, this light gray here, so this is the areas that have seagrass. This is the density, in essence, of how much seagrass is within those transects. And you can see that goes down to almost nothing in terms of, so that's why you add up, if you've lost 60% has no seagrass, you think, well, you got 40% left, but you really don't. In that 40%, you have very sparse coverage. So that's where the figures of more than 90% loss in the biomass is where I'm coming from. This is just to give you an example from the coverages. The dark areas are where there is seagrass in 2013. This is the same area in 2020. It's essentially devoid of seagrass except for really very close to the most shallow habitat. And then some other examples within the Mosquito Lagoon from 2013, transitioning 2016, 17, and 20, showing this process of loss of seagrass over time. And again, it's keyed back to excess nutrients and then algal blooms shading out and killing the seagrass itself decaying, and then fueling more algal blooms from the decaying process of even the seagrasses themselves. Just throwing in, since we're talking about manatees, but we can't talk about what's important to manatees without talking about seagrass communities. And maybe I'll take a minute and just point out from a evolutionary standpoint, manatees and seagrass communities essentially evolved together. And when manatees are allowed to free range and roam over all of the habitats that's available, they actually can make the seagrass meadows or communities more productive. And so it's a strong, positive, synergistic relationship when you have those healthy seagrass communities and you have manatees being able to free range and roam and graze where they naturally want to do that. This is to show where radio tracking and telemetry show where manatees were feeding regularly, and this is that same area what could correspond to that, but now most of all of that seagrass is no longer there, and this is in the upper Indian River Lagoon. I want to give a shout out to the Marine Resources Council. They're putting out each year basically a report card showing what the water quality status of the water quality is, and they give grades. And so if you look at the upper Indian River Lagoon, the Banana River, and even southward towards Sebastian, those were all at F's. You have a little better conditions in the northern Mosquito Lagoon, and they do a new one each year, and we've supported the last two, the Marine Resources Council, in supporting getting these report cards out and used in the legislature to help better inform. At this point, they're a little bit behind because of the way that the St. Johns River Water Management District collects and releases its data, but these are important, I think, graphic examples of what's going on in the IRL in terms of water quality. Just an example of a emaciated manatee. You can see all the ribs. You begin to, well, we'll get into some more uglier ones. So the tragedy in 2021 was that we saw 1,100 manatees die statewide, but of those, approximately 700 or more were on the east coast of Florida, most of those within this IRL region, although there was significant mortality as far south as Port Everglades area, of which, and so I wanted to present this graphic. The strong yellow, bright yellow, is where the greatest number of carcasses were recovered, and just gives you an idea where all over Florida where manatees were confirmed to have died. A number of those had to have full necropsies, but as we'll talk about briefly later, there are an awful lot of manatees that aren't necropsied anymore. They're just verified that they had died. Fortunately, there are many manatees. 149 manatees were rescued last year. And so they were able to be brought into our partners, which I'll go into a little bit further. But before I do that, I just kind of want to point out where we are today in comparison. So in 2021, through 6/17, there had been 811 manatees die in Florida, or verified to have died in Florida. We're at about 600 now. On the surface, that's better than not. We didn't have 800 die, but in terms of the IRL and that region, it was really pretty similar. We had such a large number of manatees die there that it wasn't that much better than the year before. And I won't go into a lot of other information here. And then Grant, remind me if I start going too long, but I think I'll keep it in about that time window we were talking about. So there's never been a situation until that December of 19 or December of 20 and 21 where we had manatees, large numbers of manatees dying from starvation. There has historically been way more than enough seagrass and other aquatic vegetation for manatees to sustain them and to sustain a population much larger than what we have today. I don't think I mentioned, but the best estimate the state of Florida has was from data gathered in 2015 and 16, and that suggested we had about 8,500 manatees. I can tell you we have significantly less than that today, and reproduction is going to be impacted for a decade or more going forward. So, but what was tragic, even more so than the numbers that were dying, is how they were dying and what they were suffering with. And many of those had lost more than 40% of their body weight. They had extensive organ atrophy and necrosis. There were those that were quite weak, and you can see the belly folds, and some of them were sideways swimmers that were rescued. So thankfully, through that network, I'm going to go on to that and not even get into, but this sort of lays out for you that 2022 really wasn't much better, and how the starvation was the primary mortality cause of death for the majority of those manatees that were found dead on the east coast of Florida, within the IRL in particular. Maybe this is a good time just to point out on the west coast of Florida, it's not safe. It's different. More of the problems there have been historically from red tide, which could kill over 300, has resulted in over 300 manatee deaths in a year. What I will say as a cautionary statement is that most of the systems and bays on the west coast of Florida are showing early signs of some of the significant changes from seagrass to macroalgae, increases in water or problems and increased water pollutants as nitrogen and phosphorus. Nothing to anything at this point to the level of what's happened in the IRL, but just like happened in Tampa Bay back in the 50s and 60s, we lost 85% or more of the seagrasses then. They woke up, they took really extensive remedial actions, and the majority of that seagrass was recovered. But today, if you look in old Tampa Bay, we've already started to lose back 10 or more percent there. Sarasota Bay, Charlotte Harbor, they're starting to see issues there. There's still time to address that, but we can't feel that we're secure on the West Coast either. Again, an example of a severely emaciated manatee that in some of these literally being brought in and to the system, we're able to be rehabilitated and returned to the wild. I'll talk a little bit about the supplemental feeding program and maybe leave that for questions later. It was necessary, tragically. It should never have had to be done. The Fish and Wildlife Commission and the Fish and Wildlife Service did feed over 200,000 pounds of lettuce to manatees. As I get to some of the power plant photos, I'll explain a little bit. In the beginning, it was not successful almost at all, because where they chose to put the food was where the intake side of the power plant, and it was not warm, and the manatees were, I'll show you there. So if you look at the larger overview, this is the area where they fed them, which is actually the small piece here. It's segregated off of the intake structure, and it was an area that when this power plant was completely rebuilt, there were a couple of winters where it wasn't going to produce, warm water because of cooling back the steam to water in the electric generation process, that they put in electric heaters, literally, because otherwise we would have had hundreds to thousands of manatees die while they were rebuilding that power plant to increase really to convert it from an oil fired plant to a natural gas plant using turbines. And so it's much cleaner and so forth. But, this is one of the plants that needs to go away in the future. We need to find a plan to transition manatees from their dependence on these. But in the meantime, they become dependent upon this artificial warm water, and we have to find a safe way to deal with it. But going back to the feeding effort, being that they were putting the food here, and as you'll see, here's where all the manatees are. And so they really weren't even finding the food over there. However, fortunately or unfortunately, the way you want to look at it, the power plant itself had problems last winter. And so this gives you an idea. There were close to 1,000 manatees that were dependent this winter on the power plant there and not finding the food literally next door. One of the units went down entirely. A second unit was failing. And so they turned on the heaters that were left from the repowering at that power plant. And when the heaters went on, then the manatees found that warm water. Many of those manatees actually could have remembered it from the prior years when it was used. So I'm both saying positive things, and I'm very grateful about the feeding program, but I think we can do a lot better. And there is work being done over the summer to look at and assess and look at what should happen this coming winter. Let me focus some more on the positive side. We have what's called the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership. It's made up of a large number of both the federal and state partners, as well as the zoos and aquariums. I'll leave this on for a second, maybe while I talk about it, but it it has been phenomenally successful, sadly, because that means manatees have been injured and needing this care. Manatees have been starving and needed this care. But I'm so grateful to all these different partners. We are one of the Save the Manatee Club is one of the founding members of the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, and more recently we've become the fiduciary sponsor for the organization as well. And so we're very appreciative. And no manatees are being held in captivity for display. They may be able to be seen while they're being rehabilitated, but they're not being held. So the goal of this, get them healthy and get them returned, if we can, return them to where they came from. In the case of the young manatees that have been rescued out of the IRL, most of those are being actually released in Blue Spring area and the St. John's because it's just not safe. They just couldn't do well. And also most all of those manatees are going to be returned to the wild with radio transmitters, satellite transmitters, tracking them to make sure they're really doing well. So I wanted to get some positive things in here tonight, in addition to all of the sort of gloom and doom. This is, again, just some more examples of positive circumstances where manatees were found. And this is where I want to give shout out to boaters and others who see a manatee and realize there's something wrong. Call it in to the Fish and Wildlife Commission at the 888-404-3922, and a team will be out to rescue it and bring it in. Pause here because I just like to look at pretty things once in a while. These are a couple of manatees that have been rehabilitated and were released in Blue Spring. And I just liked the photo, so I thought I'd throw it up there. Let me talk about some of the positive things that are happening too towards the restoration side. So the session before last, about $8 million was appropriated by the legislature to look at beginning restoration projects for planting of submerged aquatic vegetation. Now, much of that can't happen yet in a lot of the IRL itself because the water quality is not yet there, although in many cases around the inlets and so forth it is. This is an example of 7 different projects for Vallisneria, which is a freshwater submerged aquatic vegetation within the tributaries that feed the Indian River Lagoon, and the state of Florida is leading that. And the funding, majority of funding from that's coming from that $8 million. Plus there was also the acquisition of warm mineral springs on the west coast of Florida too, an important winter warm water refuge that will become even more important as things go along. Very quickly, we're partnering with literally dozens of other organizations and working towards restoration work within the IRL, some of that just really getting going. These are examples from Brevard Zoo's activities. We work with the Florida Oceanographic Society. We just gave them a grant also for their training and seagrass planting efforts with many different volunteers. Partnering with the Marine Resources Council, both, as I mentioned on the report card, but also to the establishment of a seagrass assembly that we want to pull the best folks together and sort of help prioritize what's going to be needed in terms of restoration work. But lots of partners. None of us can do this by ourselves. We have to depend on those partnerships. How's my time coming, Grant? I think I can.
All right, let's say another five.
Okay, I think it would be about right. Having talked a lot about power plants and those artificial warm water, I want to also, well, before that, actually getting ahead of myself, if you go to the NEP for the Indian River Lagoon, you'll see there's a lot of positive other projects going on there too. This is, you can't probably read this, but this is an example of 52 different projects that are underway that are related in one way or another to water quality or restoration and that sort of work. And I'll talk about more, but this is a drop in the bucket to what's needed. And I just want to lay out quickly how important our natural springs are. I think everyone on this call would know that, but they're also important in terms of the ecosystems themselves that they feed and contribute to, but also quite important. And as we get farther down the road, the elimination of those artificial warm water sites, the natural springs become that much more critical to the future survival of manatees. Of course, the springs themselves, in many cases, the flows are being reduced, they're being polluted. And as Florida keeps growing, we're going to see more and more pressure to pump the aquifer. And so that's a huge challenge going forward. Just kind of some spring locations, and then a nice shot of Silver Springs, which I do want to talk about a little bit. Many people would know that the Cross Florida Barge Canal came through, and then of course was deauthorized, I think, as far back as the late 60s, but yet Rodman Dam remained and continued to disrupt the normal flows that existed. So Silver Spring could be a future really major habitat for winter habitat for manatees as we continue to work with the Force Group and other organizations to restore the Ocklawaha River and get that free flowing again. I won't go into a lot of it, but it is a significant priority. There have been many different ways that manatees could have accessed different springs, and there are other springs that have been flooded out. The Silver Spring, of course, is still there. It's a large magnitude, but there are a series of other smaller springs that would be available again once that river is restored. So I'm getting close to the very end of my part of it. I do want to mention that with the Florida Springs Council and other organizations, we sued DEP over enforcement of basin management action plans for our springs. We didn't win that at the state level, but it's in the appeals court right now. It's been heard, but there's not a ruling on it yet. We certainly hope we could win that, but either way, I think the legal work that's been accomplished there has pointed out deficiencies and problems and things that will help address how the legislature can fix those basin management action plans going forward, even if we aren't successful on the appeal. These next two, I think Ragan's going to include in his talk, so I won't go into them, but I think I may have one more. Yeah, this is my last slide. So just to point out a few, there's many more things that are ongoing and need to happen, but in terms of the power plant issue, there needs to be a creation of a federal trust fund for transitioning manatees off the dependence of artificial warm water from power plants as fossil fuel electric generation is phased out. And I can compare that a little bit to the trust fund that was established for oil spills. We knew that there were going to be oil spills. We knew there were going to need to be cleaning up, and they took a small amount of money from each barrel of oil, they put it into the trust fund, and that's what we're suggesting needs to happen with the power generation. Small amount of money from each kilowatt goes into a fund, so it'll be there. We proposed this 2 decades ago, and we would have had a lot of money if they'd have done it then, but it's still a major priority because as climate change is on us. And I think there's a recent announcement too by Florida Power and Light that they are making their own pledge to be fossil fuel free and not that far in the future as well. Another one is that we're working on from a congressional standpoint and could use all the help anybody wants to give on it, is the designation of the Indian River Lagoon as a major restoration priority, similar to that for the Everglades or Chesapeake Bay. The IRL and EP has basically looked at, and there's going to be a need for $5 to $6 billion worth of funding in order to really fully restore the Indian River Lagoon. One of my things that I'm harping on for quite a while, going back to how successful the Manatee program was, but the expert manatee recovery team was disbanded about a decade ago, and we've seen neglect and things not being done that we were on top of when that was a high priority. And then again, Ragan will go into this, but we really need to see a reinitiation of formal Section 7 consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, with the EPA to compel water quality improvements and also compel that greater enforcement is put in place to do that. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over. We'll have time for questions.
Thank you, Pat. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot, and I've been in the field for 35 years, so that's always good. That's always a good thing. If you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer icon at the bottom of the screen, and we will address those. Either Pat will get back to you directly, or we will discuss them at the end of the presentation. We'll have a question and answer period. Also, there's information in the chat box if you wish to chat with folks. Next, I would like to introduce Ragan Whitlock with the Center for Biological Diversity. I spent 35 years in the environmental field and did not really know much about the Center for Biological Diversity, other than I saw their name pop up all the time. Lately, in the last 7 years, I've been working with them on a number of issues. And Ragan, would you please introduce yourself, what the Center for Biological Diversity is, and how you've been working to protect the manatees, what you have been doing, and what you hope to do in the future. Thank you.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, you can share the screen and put your PowerPoint presentation on. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Grant, for having us. My name is Ragan Whitlock. I'm a staff attorney for the Center for Biological Diversity based out of St. Petersburg, Florida. I focus largely on endangered species and water quality issues in the state of Florida. But the center has offices all across America with lawyers, scientists, and media personnel, all focused on the beauty of the animals and waterways that we have in the different states across America. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Okay, are we live there? Perfect.
Yep, gotcha.
And I see a few chats and questions there. We can answer those. I won't take too long here, and I think a few of them might get addressed while I'm speaking, and then if not, I know a lot of them are going to be great pointed questions for Pat as we get going. So what I'd like to do is first describe some of the legislative protections that have been in place for the manatee across the years very quickly, and then to describe how they've fallen short in recent years, and then to describe where we think that we can improve on those and where we've achieved some small wins, as well as attempting to compel the agencies who are tasked with protecting these species to do their job and to create some positive change moving forward. So first, just a quick rundown to give a little bit of a backstory for manatee protections. The first manatee protection law was actually adopted in the 1800s, which shows how early we realized that things truthfully needed to be done. I'm going to go ahead and skip to get to the Endangered Species Act, which is really going to be comprise a large part of what I'm talking about today, both the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act. But specifically in the Endangered Species Act, there's two sections that I think are incredibly important. And the act in general, its purpose is not only to protect the species, but to protect the ecosystems upon which those species rely. And I think that that's a big point of this talk today, is recognizing that it's the ecosystems that are failing. And if we can protect the ecosystems, then by proxy, we're going to protect the species. Now, the two sections I really want to focus on are Section 7 and Section 3. Section 3 of the Endangered Species Act is what delineates critical habitat. Critical habitat meaning an area that the manatee or any species that's endangered and on the list absolutely needs to survive. That habitat, if it fails, it's likely that we will not see recovery for the species. And then that section also details what it means to have a take of an animal. So it's a killing, harming, harassing, or modifying its habitat in any way. And then Section 7 is another big piece that we'll get to here later. It's the federal agency action section. And essentially what that details is that a federal agency cannot authorize, fund, or undertake any action that's going to adversely affect that species or that species' critical habitat. And the other big one is the Clean Water Act. And these two acts are intended to work synergistically. And sometimes it feels as though they kind of are diametrically opposed and create problems for one another. But from the Clean Water Act, Pat described the issues that we have with the Indian River Lagoon right now and the nutrient pollution. And the Clean Water Act is essentially the legislative piece that's aimed to prevent that. Florida has been delegated an incredible authority under the Clean Water Act to establish water quality standards for waterways that it deems impaired, and eventually set a numeric criteria for those pollutants that are destroying the ecosystem to help try to provide successes into the future. So not only has Florida been given that authority, but they've been given two other authorities under the Clean Water Act: the ability to handle NPDES permits, or the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits, which you can think of as power plants, phosphate facilities. For example, the Piney Point issue last year is a really big one. A point source being a pipe or any sort of entrance into our waterways directly from a facility where pollutants are discharged. They've also been delegated authority under Clean Water Act 404, which is wetlands, so dredge and fill operations, two things that rarely get captured when we're talking about nutrient pollution. It's the actual pollution from discharge sources and then these projects that disrupt wetlands. And Florida has been given the authority broadly to interpret and to set limits for these, with the backdrop that the EPA is meant to either approve or at least evaluate whether or not these standards are adequate and whether or not they can be met. And the EPA did exactly that in 2009, which we'll get to. But the second bullet point I think is incredibly critical, that when EPA reviews these TMDLs, or the loads that we set for waterways in Florida, there have to be reasonable assurances that these standards can actually be met. And those are two things we're really dealing with problems in Florida. Is the standards, even if they were met, simply are not adequate. And moreover, as said, we are not meeting them. We're constantly exceeding NPDES permits, effluents allowances, dredge and fill allowances, and then BMAPs, which we can talk about in just a minute. So the standards are inadequate, and our enforcement of these standards is woefully inadequate. Now, I described how these things are supposed to work together. For example, the Fish and Wildlife Service defines the critical habitat for the Florida manatee. And then whenever an agency action is undertaken, these expert agencies are supposed to consult together and make sure that any action is not going to impact or adversely modify the species and the area in which they live. And both of those things have failed in recent years. So let's first get into the critical habitat. Critical habitat for the manatee, as it says, is currently not appropriately defined. We have 1978 listed there. In 1976 was when the Florida manatee originally received its critical habitat. It was one of the first animals on the Endangered Species Act list to receive critical habitat. And at the time, the Endangered Species Act didn't really give a scientific background for what critical habitat should truly mean. And as a result, when we got those designations, it was merely a list of places that we knew manatees inhabited. And that was the best science that they had to go off on the time, is you see and you evaluate and you place that area on the list. But as we know now, just simply seeing a manatee in an area does not mean that that area is critical habitat. And in 1978, there were amendments to the Endangered Species Act that required that these areas, these critical habitat areas, are defined by physical and biological features essential to the conservation of the species. Now, we don't know what proposed critical habitat is going to include, but I think our sites are critical physical and biological features for the manatee. Now, to talk about shortcomings in the implementation of numeric criteria, I won't drone on because Pat described the issues that we're facing in the Indian River Lagoon perfectly. But a few issues that are combining, and I saw a question in the chat of what is it that's creating this pollution, this problem, the lack of seagrass, and it's really a culmination of things. It's permit exceedances, an issue like we had with Piney Point last year. I like to use that as a case study. A few things happened there. We had an emergency release of processed wastewater and phosphogypsum into Tampa Bay. And during that time, Tampa Bay saw more nitrogen dumped into that bay than it receives in an entire year normally. And algal blooms, red tide on the West Coast and blue-green algae on the East Coast, are both fueled by phosphorus and nitrogen. So emergency releases are a huge issue. Additionally, just the general permits that we allow to be set for a lot of these facilities are a big issue. And then you see there that less than 6 or 30% of agricultural properties are enrolled in best management practices programs. Essentially, that's a program set by FDACS that tries to get agricultural properties to enroll in practices that would lessen their impact on our waterways and our lagoons. And unfortunately, we just are not seeing enrollment in that. And a lot of the nutrient pollution that we get is just agricultural runoff, things that escape the normal systems that we have in place. They're not designated by a permit. We don't have the ability to say what we do with the emergency releases, that, you know, the amount of nitrogen in 10 days that it sees in a full year. These things are hard to quantify, and they're huge issues. Back up here. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and speed up to the current litigation so that we have plenty of time to answer some of these questions going forward. So the Center for Biological Diversity, along with Save the Manatee Club and Defenders of Wildlife, have undertaken several actions recently. And I'll start with a great win and then describe what really needs to happen in the future. The first one being critical habitat. I described earlier that the existing critical habitat for the Florida manatee is completely inadequate and does not truthfully evaluate what the manatee needs to survive. So we filed suit earlier this year against the Fish and Wildlife Service to revise the critical habitat for the manatee, and they agreed. We filed a settlement agreement on June 1st of this year that compels the Fish and Wildlife Service to propose revised critical habitat to the Federal Register by September of 2024. And I think this is really a huge deal. Not only does it show that the Fish and Wildlife Service is once again prioritizing the Florida manatee, but it gives us an opportunity as groups and interested persons in the manatee to be able to get in our opinion and to help inform this expert agency going forward. And a little background to that issue, the Center for Biological Diversity actually petitioned, and other groups as well joined that petition, petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2008 to complete this action. Everyone knew that this was a failure of the system to revise critical habitat for the manatee. And in 2008, we submitted that petition. The Fish and Wildlife Service agreed. In 2010, it came out with a 12-month finding that critical habitat revisions for the Florida manatee were absolutely critical, and that habitat modification and curtailment is the biggest issue facing the manatee. That was in 2010. But unfortunately, along with that finding, they stated that it was warranted but precluded. The but precluded is what got to us. They said that it was precluded because of agency funding and prioritization. And I think we all on the call recognize that we get the funding issue. The Fish and Wildlife Service needs to have more funds in these sorts of programs, but the prioritization is what stuck with us. This was in 2010. You know, we're 12 years later. So that means for 12 years, the agency prioritized other actions and other initiatives. So it put the manatee on the back burner. And unfortunately, it caught up. You know, like Pat said, we lost a little bit more than 1,100 manatees last year, and a lot of it came from not protecting the habitat. So we filed suit, and ultimately the Fish and Wildlife Service agreed, and it will propose revised critical habitat by September of 24. And I know that Pat might speak on this in a minute, but Save the Manatee Club and others are really trying to help bolster what those proposed revisions are going to be by working with the agency that has once again taken an initiative here to figure out what that proposed critical habitat should be, what the physical and biological features are, how we can identify warm water springs, how we can identify seagrass habitat that the manatee needs to survive. The second lawsuit has yet to be settled. This was led by Earth Justice in addition to the other groups, Save the Manatee Club, Center for Biological Diversity, and Defenders of Wildlife. And this was about Florida's numeric criteria for water. I described earlier the delegation of authority that Florida has to be able to set nutrient criteria across the state for all issues, whether it be point sources, whether it be dredge and fill programs, or basin management action plans and best management practices. Florida has a wide umbrella of what they can do. And EPA had to approve those. And the EPA did so back in 2009 and 2010 for various projects. Our lawsuit alleges that there is new information that shows that EPA's approval of Florida's numeric criteria for water was improper because it adversely affects the manatee and causes harm to their habitat. The new information that we used in that lawsuit was the die-off in the Indian River Lagoon. And if you think about it for a second, it makes a lot of sense. We have to allege that something new has happened that shows that agency action was improper. And losing 1,100 manatees last year, and more than half of those coming from the Indian River Lagoon because of a catastrophic failure of that ecosystem due to a loss of seagrass, is new information. It shows that in the last 11 years since they approved those numeric criteria for water, the amount of pollutants that were allowed to be dumped into our bays added up to the point where we had one of the most important ecosystems in Florida completely crash. And as pessimistic and as sad as that is, what our lawsuit is aimed at is to get the EPA to go back to the drawing board. And when it goes back to the drawing board and reinitiates consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service, NMFS, and Florida, the goal is to get them to revise these standards to figure out better numeric criteria, different loads of nutrients that we can allow to be dumped into our waterways every single year, and provide something that will ultimately help the manatee. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service has already agreed that this should be done. The Fish and Wildlife Service sent a letter to the EPA asking them to please reinitiate consultation with us and let's devise numeric criteria that work, and the EPA refused to do so. And we sent our notice of intent to sue, and once again, the EPA refused to do so, so we filed suit. And we're hoping that through this, it prompts agency action and we get something like what we saw with the Fish and Wildlife Service committing to propose critical habitat, that the EPA can take the torch from what Fish and Wildlife Service is doing right now, reprioritize the Florida manatee, and find a way to save the ecosystems across the state of Florida. Because I think we can easily pinpoint that the pollutants that we're allowing to be dumped into our bays and waterways are culprit number one. And with that, I think we have just the right amount of time left. I'll go ahead and stop sharing here.
Okay. Thank you. My God, that was very informative. I learned a lot again, and that's what this is all about. We do have some questions and answers. We have some questions in our question and answer box. If folks would go there and pose any questions you wish. I first would like to thank Pat Rose, who has dedicated his life to manatees for working tirelessly and not resigning or retiring, but keeping up the fight. You made a difference and you continue to make a difference. So thank you very much. I think that we all feel that way. And Ragan, you are a little bit younger. We expect you to continue on as long as Pat has and continue this fight on and move forward. You know, sometimes we don't move forward as quickly as we want, but we need to continue to move forward and continue to figure out how to solve the problems. And I think that's where the Center of Biological Diversity is a great partner. So with that, I want to thank both of you folks and thank you for being here.